Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Jack Walker had always prided himself on being the kind of engineer who could fix anything. His hands moved like clockwork over the holographic interface in front of him, adjusting settings, rerouting connections, and monitoring the constant stream of data that flowed from the consciousness management system known as the chain of consciousness. This system had revolutionized society, bringing crime rates to near zero and ensuring that every citizen lived in harmony with the government's vision of peace and order. At least, that was what everyone believed. As Jack ran a routine maintenance check, his eyes caught a flicker on one of the monitoring screens. A tiny blip of red, barely perceptible, but enough to make him pause. He leaned in closer, tapping on the screen to zoom in. The blip was a consciousness signal, an anomaly within the chain. Jack frowned, running a diagnostic. The system flagged the signal as irregular, something that should have been corrected automatically. But it wasn't. Instead, the signal persisted, stronger and more erratic with every passing second. Jack's frown deepened as he isolated the signal and pulled up the data. The signal belonged to a woman named Samantha Miller, 30 years old, living in a small, nondescript apartment in the city's lower district. The system labeled her as an infected, a term used for those whose consciousness could not be fully controlled by the chain. Usually, these cases were rare, and when they appeared, the system quickly corrected them. But Samantha's signal was different. It didn't follow the patterns of the usual disturbances. There was something almost deliberate about it. Jack knew what he was supposed to do. Flag the anomaly, report it to the authorities, and let them deal with it. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way the signal seemed to pulse with a kind of rhythm, a pattern that didn't make sense, but at the same time, felt almost like a heartbeat. Curious, he hesitated, his fingers hovering over the command to report. Instead, he rerouted the signal, masking it from the system's broader network and isolating it on his own terminal. He wasn't sure why he did it, but there was a voice in his mind, quiet but insistent, telling him that this was important, that he needed to understand what was happening before taking any action. As he continued to analyze the signal, Jack found himself pulled into a deeper mystery. The data from Samantha's consciousness was unlike anything he had seen before. It was chaotic, yes, but beneath the chaos, there was a complexity, a depth that hinted at something far more profound than mere system malfunction. It was as if her mind was trying to communicate, to reach out beyond the confines of the chain's control. And that intrigued him. Days passed, and Jack became increasingly obsessed with Samantha's signal. He began to spend more time monitoring her consciousness, even going so far as to follow her movements in the physical world through the city's surveillance network. He watched as she went about her daily life, noting the small ways in which she differed from the other citizens, her hesitation at the crosswalks, the way she paused to look up at the sky as if searching for something, the moments of stillness where her face would take on an expression of deep thought, of rebellion. It wasn't long before Jack's curiosity led him to an even more startling discovery. Samantha wasn't just resisting the chain, she was actively working against it. He found evidence of encrypted messages buried within her consciousness signal, messages that were being transmitted to others across the city. The content of these messages was a mystery, but the fact that they existed at all was a direct challenge to the chain's authority. Jack's initial curiosity turned to concern, then fear. He had stumbled upon something far bigger than a mere system glitch. This was a full-blown resistance movement, and he was now inadvertently a part of it. He knew the consequences if the authorities found out. Treason. Execution. The chain did not tolerate dissent. And yet, despite the danger, Jack couldn't bring himself to turn Samantha in. There was something about her, about the way she fought against the system, that struck a chord deep within him. It was as if her defiance was awakening something that had long been dormant in his own mind. Finally, Jack made a decision that would change his life forever. He hacked into the city's transport network, rerouting one of the automated vehicles to bring Samantha to him. It was a risky move, one that could easily be traced back to him if he wasn't careful. But he had to speak to her, to understand what she knew, what she was fighting for. He had to know why her mind was different, why she had not succumbed to the chain's control. When Samantha arrived at his small, sparsely furnished apartment, she was cautious, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of a trap. Jack quickly reassured her, explaining who he was and what he had discovered. To his surprise, Samantha seemed more amused than alarmed. "You've been watching me," she said, a slight smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Why?" "Because you're different," Jack replied, struggling to find the right words. "The system can't control you." "I wanted to know why." Samantha's smile faded, replaced by a look of intense focus. "It's not that it can't control me," she said slowly. "It's that I refuse to let it. The chain isn't just about keeping the peace. It's about control, total control. Of our thoughts, our actions, everything that makes us human. I won't be a part of that." Jack listened, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always believed that the chain was a force for good, that it kept society safe. But now, as he looked into Samantha's eyes, he realized that safety had come at a terrible cost. The chain didn't just prevent crime, it prevented freedom, creativity, individuality. It turned people into machines, cogs in a vast, soulless machine. "And what do you plan to do?" Jack asked, though he already knew the answer. "We're going to destroy it," Samantha said, her voice steady, unyielding. "But we need your help." Jack didn't hesitate. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of purpose, a calling that went beyond the confines of his job. He knew the risks, but he also knew that he couldn't live with himself if he did nothing. And so, he agreed to join Samantha and her underground resistance, to use his skills to help them dismantle the very system he had once sworn to protect. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Jack worked tirelessly, using his insider knowledge to bypass security protocols, disable surveillance systems, and gather intelligence on the chain's most vulnerable points. Samantha and the other resistance members, a small but determined group, planned their strike with meticulous precision. They knew that failure was not an option. If they were caught, the chain would tighten its grip on the city, and any hope of freedom would be lost forever. As the day of the attack drew closer, Jack felt a growing sense of dread. He had never been a soldier, never fought in a war. He was just an engineer, a man who worked with circuits and code. But now, he was about to become something else, something dangerous. The plan was simple. They would infiltrate the chain's central hub, located in a heavily fortified building in the heart of the city. Once inside, they would upload a virus that Jack had designed, a virus that would corrupt the chain's core programming and trigger a massive system failure. It was a risky, all-or-nothing move, but it was their only chance. On the night of the attack, the city was eerily quiet. The streets were empty, the usual hum of activity replaced by a tense, foreboding silence. Jack, dressed in black and armed with a small, concealable weapon, met Samantha and the others at a predetermined location near the hub. Their faces were grim, their resolve unshaken. This was it, the moment of truth. They moved swiftly and silently through the city's deserted alleys, avoiding the security drones that patrolled the area. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the hub's entrance, a massive, steel-reinforced door guarded by armed sentries. He held his breath as Samantha approached the guards, using a stolen access card to bypass their security checks. For a moment, he feared they would be caught, but the guards barely glanced at them before allowing them through. The resistance had timed their attack perfectly, striking during a shift change when security was at its weakest. Inside the hub, the air was thick with tension. The building was a maze of corridors, each one monitored by cameras and sensors. But Jack had planned for this. Using a handheld device, he scrambled the hub's surveillance systems, creating a window of opportunity for them to reach the central control room. As they neared their destination, Jack felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the culmination of all their planning, all their sacrifices. But just as they rounded the final corner, disaster struck. A group of guards, alerted by a faint signal from one of the compromised cameras, appeared at the end of the corridor, weapons drawn. Samantha reacted instantly, firing her weapon and taking out the first guard before he could sound the alarm. The others followed suit, engaging the remaining guards in a fierce firefight. Jack, unaccustomed to violence, could only watch in horror as the battle unfolded. The corridor was filled with the deafening sound of gunfire, the air thick with smoke and the scent of blood. He saw Samantha take a hit, her body jerking as a bullet grazed her shoulder. But she didn't stop. She pushed forward, determined to reach the control room. "Go," she shouted at Jack, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "You have to finish this." Jack hesitated, torn between helping her and completing the mission. But he knew what had to be done. With one last look at Samantha, he turned and ran towards the control room, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the guards behind him, their shouts growing louder as they realized what was happening. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Inside the control room, Jack quickly locked the door behind him, sealing himself inside. The room was filled with rows of servers, each one humming with the power of the chain. He approached the central terminal, his hands trembling as he plugged in the virus. The screen flashed as the virus began to upload, lines of code scrolling across the monitor at lightning speed. Outside, the sounds of the battle grew louder, closer. Jack could hear the guards pounding on the door, trying to break through. He knew he didn't have much time. He watched the progress bar on the screen, willing it to move faster. 50%. 60%. 70%. The door shook as the guards threw their full weight against it. The metal began to buckle, and Jack knew it was only a matter of seconds before they got in. 80%. 90%. A loud crash echoed through the room as the door finally gave way. The guards poured in, their weapons aimed at Jack. But it was too late. The virus had completed its upload. The chain servers began to overload, sparks flying as the system started to collapse under the strain. Jack stood frozen, his heart pounding in his ears as the guards closed in. But before they could reach him, the room was plunged into darkness. The servers powered down, one by one, until the entire hub was silent. The chain was broken. In the aftermath, the city descended into chaos. Without the chain's control, the people began to wake up, their minds free for the first time in years. But with freedom came fear, confusion, and anger. The streets were filled with people demanding answers, demanding justice for the years they had been enslaved by the chain. Jack walked through the wreckage of the city, his mind numb with exhaustion. He had done what he set out to do, but at what cost? Samantha was gone, sacrificed in the name of freedom. The city was in ruins, its people lost and directionless. He had freed them from the chain, but now they had to find a way to rebuild their lives, to reclaim their humanity. As he stood in the middle of the city square, surrounded by the ruins of the world he had helped create, Jack felt a deep sense of loss. He had given the people their freedom, but he couldn't help but wonder if they were truly ready for it. Freedom was a heavy burden, one that many would struggle to carry, but as the sun began to rise over the shattered skyline, Jack knew that there was hope. The chain was gone, and with it, the oppressive control that had stifled the city for so long. Now, it was up to the people to decide their own future, to rebuild their lives in a world where they were no longer bound by the chain. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decisions settle on his shoulders. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but it was a road worth traveling. And for the first time in his life, Jack felt truly free.